In the public square 500 years ago, a crowd is gathering, not to protest, not to celebrate. They've come to watch a man be executed in a way specifically designed to take days. And here's the part that should stop you. They brought their children. We look back at the worst punishments in human history, and we ask the obvious question: how could people be so cruel? But that's the wrong question, and it hides something far more disturbing. Because these punishments weren't the work of a few monsters. They were public, they were legal, they were popular, and ordinary people, people like you, turned up in their thousands to watch. So here's what we're actually going to uncover. Why the most brutal punishments ever invented were almost never really about causing pain. There's a hidden psychological engine underneath all of them, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Why these punishments were designed to be watched, and what that crowd was really there for. And the strangest part of all, the reason we stopped, which had almost nothing to do with becoming kinder people. By the end of this, you're going to understand something uncomfortable about the crowd in that square, and about yourself. Let's start with the thing everyone gets wrong. Here's the first thing that sounds impossible until you understand it. The goal was almost never the pain itself. We assume the worst punishments in history were about inflicting maximum suffering on the person being punished. But if you actually study them, a strange pattern appears. The suffering of the individual was almost beside the point. The real target was everyone else. Think about the most infamous methods history recorded: the breaking wheel in medieval Europe, public executions that were deliberately drawn out over hours or days, bodies left on display at city gates long after death. If the only aim were to remove a criminal, none of this makes sense. You don't need a multi-day public spectacle to end a single life. A quiet execution would do it. So why the theater? Why the crowd, the square, the slow ceremony? Because the punishment wasn't a punishment. It was a message. And the person on the scaffold was not the audience. They were the medium the message was written on. In a world with no police force as we know it, no surveillance, no fingerprint databases, no way to reliably catch most criminals, rulers had exactly one tool to keep order: fear. Not fear of being caught, because you probably wouldn't be. Fear of what would happen in the rare case that you were. The horror had to be so extreme, so unforgettable, that the memory alone would stop 1,000 people from ever committing the crime. The punishment was cruel to one person in order to control everyone who watched. So that's the first loop closed. The worst punishments in history were rarely about the individual's pain. They were broadcasts aimed at the crowd in an age when terror was the only law enforcement that scaled. But that raises a harder question. If the goal was to send a message, why did the message have to be so unimaginably brutal? Why not just a quick, frightening death? There's a psychological reason, and it's the engine underneath all of it. Here's the question that unlocks everything. Why did the punishments keep getting more elaborate over time instead of just staying frightening enough to work? The answer is a principle you experience in your own life every single day. We get used to things. Psychologists call it habituation. The first time you experience something shocking, it hits hard. The 10th time, less so. The 100th time, it barely registers. Your brain is built to notice change and to tune out whatever stays the same. It's why a new sound in your house wakes you at night, but the constant hum of the fridge disappears completely. Now apply that to a society built on public punishment. The first brutal execution terrifies everyone, but hold them regularly and the crowd adapts. The horror fades. It becomes routine, then almost mundane. And a punishment that no longer horrifies, no longer deters. The entire system depended on maintaining fear, and fear, by its nature, wears off. So authorities did the only thing the logic allowed. They escalated. Each generation's punishments had to be more elaborate, more prolonged, more publicly staged than the last, just to produce the same jolt of terror that a simpler method once achieved on its own. It was an arms race against human psychology, against the crowd's own ability to get used to anything. And this is the genuinely dark part. The escalation wasn't driven by rulers becoming more evil. It was driven by ordinary people becoming numb. The cruelty had to keep climbing precisely because the audience kept adapting to it. The monster wasn't only on the throne. It was partly in the crowd's ability to watch horror and eventually to feel nothing. There's the second loop. The punishments grew more extreme not out of pure sadism, but because human beings adapt to anything, and a system running on terror has to keep climbing to outrun its own audience. And this brings us to the strangest question of all. If people could get used to almost any level of horror, if the crowds kept coming, if the system kept working on its own terms, then what actually made it stop? And the answer is not what you'd hope. Remember what I promised at the start, that we stopped for reasons that had almost nothing to do with becoming kinder people. Here's what that means. The comforting story we tell ourselves is that humanity simply grew a conscience, that we looked at these punishments, recognized how monstrous they were, and chose to be better. And there's some truth in it. Thinkers began arguing that punishment should fit the crime, that the state shouldn't sink to the level of the worst criminal, that cruelty degraded everyone, not just the target. But that's not the whole story, and probably not even the main one. Because the bigger change was practical. As societies developed real institutions, organized police, prisons, records, courts that could actually investigate and catch people, the entire purpose of public terror collapsed. When you can reliably catch and imprison a criminal, you no longer need to terrify 100,000 bystanders to keep order. The certainty of being caught replaced the horror of what happened if you were. Researchers who study the history of punishment point to exactly this shift. Deterrence stopped depending on spectacle and started depending on inevitability. And once the spectacle no longer served a function, the appetite for it faded fast. Punishment moved out of the public square and behind closed walls. It stopped being a show. So here's the uncomfortable version of the truth. We didn't necessarily stop because we no longer stomached the cruelty. We largely stopped because we invented something that worked better. The kindness came, but it arrived alongside a system that no longer needed the terror in the first place. That's the final loop. What ended the worst punishments in human history wasn't only a softening of the human heart. It was the rise of institutions that made the public horror unnecessary. We should be honest about how much of our mercy was built on top of that. So where does that leave us? Let's put it all together. The worst punishments in human history weren't really about the pain of the person being punished. They were public broadcasts of fear, the only tool that worked in a world that couldn't reliably catch criminals. They escalated over centuries, not simply because people got crueler, but because people got numb, and a system running on terror has to keep climbing to outrun its own audience. And they ended less because we suddenly became gentle, and more because we built institutions that made the spectacle pointless. Here's the part worth sitting with. It's easy to look back at that crowd in the square, the one that brought their children to watch, and feel certain you're nothing like them, that you would have turned away, that your conscience would have refused. But every piece of this story says otherwise. The crowd wasn't made of monsters. It was made of ordinary people, shaped by the world they lived in, watching what their society told them was normal, and slowly, quietly getting used to it. The thing that made those punishments possible wasn't a special kind of evil. It was the most ordinary human trait there is, the ability to adapt to almost anything until it stops shocking us at all. Which leaves one question that isn't really about the past at all. What are we watching today, scrolling past, growing numb to, that a future version of humanity will look back on and ask the same thing we ask about that crowd? How did they just sit there and watch? The people in that square weren't so different from us. That's exactly what should make you uncomfortable.